That night, my son clinked his glass and whispered, "It's all done, Mum. You just stay quiet." I smiled, but inside I froze. He had no idea. That signature meant nothing anymore. That same night, I left without a word, and $15 million slipped beyond their reach. For good, I lived in that house for over 40 years. 2 floors, white shutters, creaky oak floors that still held the echo of my children's footsteps. After my husband passed, people expected I'd move somewhere smaller, easier, but I stayed. Not because I couldn't leave, but because leaving meant accepting that everything had changed. Every morning I made coffee for one instead of two. I watered the plants he used to grumble about. I folded his shirts that no longer needed folding. And at night, I sat in the same armchair, across from the empty one, and pretended not to notice the silence pressing against my chest. I was 70 then. People think 70 means fragile. I wasn't. But I was tired, not of life, just of carrying the weight of everyone else's comfort, while setting mine aside for decades. Mitchell, my oldest, visited once a month. Always polite, always on schedule. His wife, Vanessa, came along too, with that high-energy smile and tone of voice that made everything sound like a sales pitch. They never stayed long, but the conversations always circled back to the same idea. "Mum, have you ever thought about moving into a senior community? Mum, you'd be so much safer in a place with full-time care. Mum, it's not about pushing you out, it's about helping you enjoy life." I used to nod, smile, say I'd think about it. I never did. Then one afternoon, they came earlier than usual. No warning, Vanessa brought almond croissants I never liked. Mitchell had a folder in his hand. That folder told me everything before he said a word. He talked for 10 minutes straight, about amenities, about how nice the rooms were, about how I wouldn't have to worry about upkeep or snow or raking leaves. His voice was calm, but too rehearsed. I kept my face blank and just nodded. Then Vanessa leaned forward, placed her hand on mine, and said softly, "We've already toured the place, Eudora. It's lovely, and we've gone ahead and reserved a suite for you. You don't need to lift a finger. Just say yes." It hit me harder than I expected. Not because they wanted me safe, but because they had made a decision. Without me. About me. Like I was a piece of old furniture to be placed where convenient. I looked at the folder. The papers were crisp, the contract signed, but not by me. I didn't say anything that day. Not a single protest. Not a single tear. I closed the folder gently and handed it back to Mitchell. "Thank you for thinking of me. I'll let you know that night, I stood in the middle of the kitchen. My kitchen, the one I painted yellow in 1986 because it reminded me of sunflowers. And for the first time since my husband died, I didn't feel sadness. I felt something else, a slow, burning clarity. This house held decades of memories, of family dinners, of burned toast, of first steps and slammed doors. And now the same walls were witnessing the quiet unraveling of what I thought family meant. I knew what I had to do, not out of revenge, not even out of anger, but because I saw the writing on the wall, and I was done pretending I didn't. Tell me, have you ever looked at the people you love and realized they stopped seeing you as a person a long time ago? I had. And I wasn't going to let them erase me quietly. Not this time. The following Sunday they came back, this time with a smile too bright and a casserole too warm. Vanessa placed the dish on my counter like she owned the place, humming softly, moving around my kitchen like it already wasn't mine. Mitchell sat at the table and started flipping through something on his tablet. Not even 5 minutes in, he looked up and said, "I found a spot that's closer. Still top tier, still safe. Just more convenient. He meant convenient for him, not for me. I poured myself a cup of coffee and listened without blinking. Vanessa sat across from me, legs crossed neatly, eyes glowing with the excitement of someone who thought they were doing a great job at something. She started listing features like she was on a commercial: heated floors, on-site salon, personal chef, weekend outings to local vineyards. She paused between each one, watching my face closely, hoping for a spark of gratitude. I gave her none. Then she pulled out a small cream-colored envelope and slid it toward me. Her voice softened. "They're having a fall open house. Next weekend. We thought it might be nice if we went together." I didn't touch the envelope. I just stared at it. Then I looked up and said, "I'm not interested." Vanessa blinked, lips tightening for a second before she smiled again, but the air shifted. Mitchell cleared his throat. He tried a different tone. "It's not about interest, Mum. It's about what's best for everyone. You deserve peace, and we need to know you're safe. You're living here alone. Anything could happen." The irony landed sharp. I had raised 2 children in this house, took care of it through snowstorms, plumbing disasters, even a raccoon in the attic once. Alone. But suddenly my presence was a risk, an inconvenience. Mitchell leaned forward, laced his fingers together, and continued. "We just want to help. If something ever happened to you here, alone, we wouldn't forgive ourselves." He meant if something happened while I was still on the deed. I smiled, not wide, not warm, just enough to make him think I was still open to persuasion. Vanessa glanced at him, then back at me. "We've even looked into a downsizing agent. They can take care of the house listing and everything. It'll be a breeze, a breeze." That's how she described 40 years of memories, 3 decades of marriage, and the one place that still smelled like my late husband's aftershave if the sun hit the hallway just right. I looked around my home. The photos on the mantel. The chip on the stair from when Mitchell tripped, carrying his science project in 5th grade. The dent on the pantry door from when he kicked it during his teenage tantrum. They wanted to sell it all. For convenience. I turned back to them, voice calm. "Thank you. I'll consider it." Vanessa beamed again, already mentally crossing it off her list. Mitchell relaxed, tapping something on his tablet. I watched him. His fingers moved with a kind of precision I hadn't seen before. Not nervous, not unsure, just methodical. They stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about nonsense, the weather, a new Thai place they tried. Vanessa asked if I needed help organizing my medications. I declined. She insisted. I declined again. When they left, Mitchell hugged me, but it was a half hug, his arm barely touching my shoulder. Vanessa kissed the air near my cheek and said, "We're doing this out of love." The door closed. I stood in the entryway for a long while, holding that untouched envelope. It was subtle, but it was happening. The shift, from mother to burden, from woman to object, from person to property. I placed the envelope in the kitchen drawer and made myself another cup of coffee. Black. No sugar, just like I used to drink when I worked late into the night doing taxes for 5 branches of the airport services group. Back when I was valuable. Back when nobody thought to move me aside. That night, I opened the old lockbox in my closet. Inside was the folder. My folder. The one with all the account numbers, the trust details, the passwords only I knew. My name on everything, not Mitchell's, not Vanessa's, $15 million, spread across 12 years of smart, quiet investing, dividends, property shares, bonds tucked under different entities. No one knew. I closed the box and sat down on my bed. The house was quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like clarity. It started with a misdelivered email. I had kept my old email account from my working years. It was rarely used now, mostly flooded with newsletters I never read and bank statements I had already redirected. But that afternoon, I checked it. Something nudged me to. There it was. A message from a bank I didn't recognize. Subject line, final authorization reminder. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. But then I saw my name, full legal name, in the preview line. I clicked. The email contained details for a financial authorization request, an account number I didn't recognize, a line about durable power of attorney, a signature line, and there, beneath it, was a typed name. Mine. But the signature was not mine. I stared at it. I read the whole email twice, then a third time. The words swam, but the meaning was sharp. Someone had submitted paperwork to finalize a power of attorney transfer. Someone had used my name, my information, and someone had forged my signature. I didn't need to guess who. I closed the laptop. My fingers felt cold even in the summer heat. I stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table staring out the window at the hydrangeas blooming along the fence line. They looked so peaceful, so ordinary. But inside me, something cracked. This wasn't just a push to relocate me. It was a plan, a structured, calculated plan. And it had moved far enough that a legal institution had nearly finalized it without ever speaking to me in person. My mind raced back over the last few visits. Mitchell's smooth language, Vanessa's pre-scripted charm, the way they talked around me, not to me, how confident they'd become. And the envelope, the signature on the folder, the fact that the house was never directly discussed again. They weren't hoping I'd move. They were counting on it. I pulled out a small legal pad from the drawer beside the sink, the one I used to make grocery lists. I wrote down the bank's name, the reference number, the timestamp on the email. Then I circled the word forged. I needed help. Not panic, not confrontation. Help. The next morning, I made a phone call to someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Her name was Trina, and she used to be the estate attorney for one of the companies my husband consulted for. I remembered her because she had sharp eyes and didn't flinch when men tried to talk over her. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I was looking into revising some older documents and wanted a private consultation. She asked one question. I gave one answer. We met the next day in a quiet cafe just off the downtown strip, 2 hours from where I lived. I brought the printout of the email and my old will. She brought a yellow legal pad and a pen that clicked too loudly. She read everything without a word. Then she looked up and said, "This isn't a misunderstanding. It's fraud. You need to act now." I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just nodded. We spent the next 2 hours going over every detail. She asked for all the institutions I had accounts with, every property, every beneficiary line, every document that could be vulnerable. I had it all, because I had always kept records, quietly, carefully, because I had never trusted ease. She made a list, then made a call, then another. By that afternoon, most of my accounts were either frozen or flagged for unusual activity. New access codes were created, passwords reset, paper statements redirected. The next step was to formally revoke any existing powers of attorney that had been filed without my consent. We filed that paperwork within the week. All through it, I said very little. I didn't need to say much. The facts were speaking loud enough. That night, back at home, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. The sky was streaked with that golden purple light, that only happens at the end of a dry summer day. I watched it fade while my phone buzzed on the table next to me. I didn't pick it up. I didn't have to look to know it was Mitchell. A new voicemail came through. Then another. When I finally listened, his voice was flat, rehearsed. "Hey, Mum. Just checking in. Vanessa said you might be acting a little distant lately. Anyway, hope you're well. Call me when you can." I saved the message. Not because it meant anything, but because it marked something. The first time his tone carried even a thread of nervousness. That night, I opened the lockbox again. This time, I didn't just look. I started removing documents, organizing them into folders, scanning the ones I'd need to transfer. And at the bottom of the box, beneath years of paperwork, was a small photo album, one of those cheap ones with the plastic sleeves and faded cover. Inside were pictures. Mitchell as a baby, holding a wooden spoon like it was a sword. Vanessa at their wedding, smiling beside me like we were already family. A trip to Arizona, Christmas in Ohio, my husband's birthday. All of us at the table, laughing. I closed it. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. And that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind had finally clicked into motion. For years, I had quieted myself for the sake of peace. Now, peace looked different. It looked like boundaries, like silence with purpose. At sunrise, I got dressed, made a fresh pot of coffee, and pulled out my red leather planner from the back of the closet. I hadn't used it since my husband's funeral. Back then, I thought I was done making plans. But now I needed every page. The first step was to contact Trina again. Not to ask questions this time, just to confirm we were moving ahead. I told her I wanted everything tightened: account protections, access restrictions, legal positioning. I wanted my will updated, my healthcare directives rewritten, and my power of attorney revised with explicit conditions. She didn't ask why. She just said she'd draw it up. Then I drove to the bank, not the local branch where Mitchell worked. A different one, out of town, where nobody knew my name. I met with a manager, provided all necessary ID, and requested 2 major changes. First, I transferred a significant portion of my liquid assets into an irrevocable trust. Second, I added a clause preventing any amendment or revocation without my direct, in-person authorization. By noon, it was done. That money was no longer mine in the traditional sense, but it was safe, untouchable, and it was no longer bait. On my way home, I stopped at the UPS store and rented a private mailbox. I set up paper statements to be redirected there. All future correspondence, especially anything related to my home or healthcare, would no longer go through my main address. I didn't want Vanessa opening my mail again under the pretense of helping me sort. Back at home, I moved quietly. I didn't make phone calls from the kitchen anymore. I didn't leave documents on the counter. I took down the family calendar that still had birthdays marked and replaced it with a plain whiteboard. I didn't want any reminders. Not of who they were, or who I had been for them. That Friday, Mitchell dropped by again. No warning this time. Just the sound of his car pulling up while I was trimming the hedges. He smiled as he walked up the driveway, waving casually like we were still in the same world. I stood up straight, brushed the dirt off my gloves, and waited. He started with pleasantries, asked about the flowers, commented on how good I looked. Then, without pause, he mentioned a small detail. Vanessa's been in touch with a real estate consultant, just to get a feel for the market. No pressure, of course, just info gathering. I nodded once and said, "That's thoughtful." He seemed surprised. I could see it flicker across his face. He wasn't expecting calm. He was expecting resistance, maybe even tears. But I didn't offer any. He followed me into the kitchen, where I poured him a glass of water. He sat at the table, glancing at the empty counters, the missing calendar. The space looked colder now, cleaner, less like the home he remembered. He took a sip of water and leaned forward slightly. Look, Mum, I know this stuff is hard, but we're just trying to make things easier for everyone. It's not about control, it's about peace of mind. I smiled. Then I excused myself and stepped into the den. I returned with a sealed envelope and placed it on the table in front of him. He looked down, hesitated. "What's this?" I said. "An update, just in case you're curious." He opened it. Inside was a one-page letter from Trina's office stating that all previous legal authorizations had been revoked, that no one, including family, had financial or medical authority over me, that all new directives were on file with her office and protected under independent legal counsel. Mitchell didn't speak. He read the page twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't gloat. I didn't glare. I just stood there, waiting. After a moment, he set the envelope down, adjusted his sleeves, and said, "You've been busy." I said nothing. He left not long after. No hug, no casserole this time, just a glance over his shoulder and a quiet, "Take care." When the door clicked shut, I locked it. Then I sat in the living room and let the quiet fill the space. It wasn't the same quiet from weeks ago. This silence was earned, controlled, mine. That weekend, I boxed up more things. I labeled them, organized them, but didn't tape the boxes shut. Not yet. There was still one more piece to move. I called Eleanor the following Monday. We hadn't spoken in years, but she answered like no time had passed. Eleanor had once worked in community development. Now she ran a non-profit in Portland, supporting widowed women, navigating retirement and housing. I told her I needed a favor. Not money, just names. People I could trust. A place I could move that wasn't just safe, but meaningful. She told me she had an extra room at the community house. Quiet, secure, private, no pressure. I said I'd think about it. We both knew I already had. By the end of that week, I had updated my mailing address, closed out my local utilities, and hired a small moving service to pack what I couldn't carry myself. Mitchell called twice. I didn't pick up. Vanessa texted once, a single sentence. "Let us know what's going on." I didn't respond, not because I didn't care, but because I had already said everything I needed to, without ever raising my voice. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing you can give someone. And mine was long overdue. The last morning in Nebraska was still. Not quiet in the way that makes you uneasy, but in the way that comes when something inside finally settles. I stood by the window, looking out at the same front yard I had trimmed and watered for 30 years. The hedge was a little overgrown, the mailbox leaned slightly to the left, and the swing on the porch creaked faintly in the breeze. I wouldn't miss any of it. My boxes were lined up in the hallway, labeled with care. I had chosen what to take and what to leave behind, like someone editing a long letter. I didn't want trinkets, just essentials, documents, books, clothes, a framed photo of myself in college, not of anyone else. At 7:30 sharp, the moving van pulled up. No logo, no uniform, just a silver truck and a young man named Kyle who greeted me with a nod. I liked that. No questions, no fuss. He helped me load everything. We didn't speak much. I told him what to be careful with, and he handled each item like it was sacred. By the time we shut the back of the truck, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the driveway. We drove for hours, mostly in silence. I didn't watch the rearview mirror. There was nothing in that house I needed to see again. We stopped overnight just outside of Denver. I took the room at the far end of the motel, small and plain, with a worn desk and an armchair under the window. I didn't turn on the television. Instead, I sat with my red leather ledger, the one I hadn't opened in months. Inside were the handwritten notes of every transfer I had made over the years. Quiet investments, deferred payments. The numbers had always been my language. That night, they comforted me. By morning, Eleanor had called. Her voice was just as I remembered. Warm, no nonsense, and 3 steps ahead. She said the room was ready. I said I'd be there by afternoon. We rolled into Portland around 3. The house was tucked into a quiet street, lined with tall pines and old porches. Painted soft green with white trim, it looked exactly like the kind of place someone might pass without noticing. Perfect. Eleanor met me at the front door, wearing an apron dusted with flour. She hugged me once, brief and firm, and said, "Welcome home." Inside smelled like lemons and thyme. There were fresh flowers on the table and soft jazz playing from a radio on the windowsill. The space felt lived in, but never tired. I was shown to a room on the first floor. It had a window facing the garden, a bookshelf half full, and a burgundy quilt folded at the foot of the bed. I ran my fingers by shadows over the stitching. It wasn't store-bought. I unpacked slowly that evening. 2 blouses in the closet, my toothbrush by the sink, the college photo on the desk. I didn't put up anything else. I didn't need to. Over tea that night, Eleanor told me about the women who had come through before me. A nurse from Montana, a school principal from New Jersey, a retired mechanic's wife from Mississippi. Each one arrived carrying more silence than luggage. Each one left with a little less weight. We didn't talk about Mitchell. Or Vanessa. I didn't mention Nebraska. She didn't ask. In the days that followed, I helped with the garden. I read quietly in the afternoons. I met the other women. Nobody asked what anyone had run from. We all just knew. One afternoon, I took my ledger out to the garden and sat under the sycamore tree. I called Trina. "I want to transfer the trust," I told her. "Not permanently, just structurally. For protection." "To whom?" she asked. "Eleanor," I said, "but not for herself. For what she's building." She didn't argue. She just said, "I'll draft the paperwork." We spent that week reviewing everything. I wanted every cent of the $15 million to be repurposed, not hidden, not guarded, but used. The new foundation would fund transitional housing, financial workshops, and mental health counseling for widowed women over 60. No family oversight, no strings attached. By Friday, it was done. The trust was no longer attached to my name, but to a cause. The papers were filed, the funds sealed. I stared at the final signature for a long time. Not because I doubted it, but because I finally felt weightless. I didn't tell Mitchell, I didn't tell Vanessa, I didn't leave a note or a voicemail. There was nothing to explain. That week, Mitchell called twice. I didn't pick up. Vanessa sent a text that said, "Just let us know what's happening." I turned off my phone and placed it in the back of a drawer. They had already taken too much of my time. They wouldn't take my peace. Sometimes leaving isn't about escaping, it's about choosing. And this time, I chose me. The invitation came in a pale blue envelope, hand-delivered to the mailbox outside the Portland house. It was from Vanessa. The handwriting was careful, but too perfect, like it had been traced. Inside was a printed card with gold trim and cursive letters that read, "A family celebration in honor of Mother Eudora. A farewell dinner before her move to Greenhaven residence." I sat at the kitchen table, reading it twice. Greenhaven Residence. That was the name of the retirement community they had tried to push me into. They had no idea I was already gone. I stared at the card. It was a performance, a script they had written without my lines, a dinner not to honor me, but to cement their narrative. One last attempt to control the story. I called Trina. She told me not to respond. Not legally, not socially. Just let them believe I was playing along. So I did. 2 days later, I bought a new outfit. Simple, grey, linen, comfortable shoes, a suitcase just for show. I arranged a flight out of Portland the same night as the dinner. Not back to Nebraska. Just a short hop to Seattle, where I planned to stay with an old colleague for a week before returning quietly. Mitchell called to confirm. His voice was upbeat, maybe even smug. He asked if I was ready to settle in at Greenhaven. I told him I was looking forward to seeing everyone. That part was true. That evening, I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. It was one of those high-end places with white tablecloths and waiters in pressed vests, the kind Vanessa liked to show off at. The table was set for 8. They had invited close family, a few of Mitchell's friends, and even a representative from Greenhaven who sat at the far end of the table with a small folder beside her plate. Vanessa greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. Her smile was wide but didn't reach her eyes. She handed me a silk gift bag. Inside was a monogrammed robe and a box of herbal teas. I thanked her and sat down. Across the table, Mitchell lifted his glass. To Mum, for being strong enough to make this transition. You've earned your rest. The others raised their glasses. I smiled and sipped. The food came. I barely tasted it. The representative from Greenhaven leaned toward me halfway through dinner and said she looked forward to welcoming me the next morning. I nodded politely. She didn't know there would be no arrival. As dessert was served, Mitchell pulled out a small folder and slid it across the table. Just a few things to sign, he said. Routine stuff. To help us manage everything more smoothly, I opened the folder slowly. Inside were forms, power of attorney, financial access, a clause about guardianship in the event of mental decline. All pre-filled, just waiting for my signature. I closed the folder and placed it gently back in front of him. Let's not do this tonight, I said softly. Not at my farewell dinner. He smiled like a man who had already won. Vanessa took the folder and tucked it into her purse, her hand resting on it like it was a trophy. The night dragged on with laughter and wine. I laughed too, though not for the same reasons. I looked at each face around that table and thought about how far I had come. How none of them had noticed the woman they were trying to bury had already slipped out the side door. After dinner, I thanked everyone, hugged a few of them, and posed for a photo. Mitchell held the camera high. Vanessa leaned in. I said goodbye, told them I'd see them tomorrow at the check-in, then stepped into the waiting cab outside. I didn't go home. I went straight to the airport. My flight left at 11:25. I watched the lights of Portland shrink behind me as we took off. In my bag was a small envelope. Inside was a copy of the signed trust transfer, the full document with Eleanor's foundation listed as the sole beneficiary. It was real, irrevocable, and already filed. The next morning, while Mitchell and Vanessa waited at Greenhaven with smiles and fresh paperwork, I was walking along the Puget Sound, sipping coffee and letting the wind whip through my hair. I turned off my phone. Not in anger, in freedom. They could host a dozen more dinners. They could rehearse speeches and prepare forms. But I was no longer in the room. The performance was over, and I had written the ending myself. The morning after the dinner, I woke up in a small rental cabin tucked behind a grove of pines in the outskirts of Seattle. The bed was simple, the sheets a little stiff from air drying, and the walls carried that faint scent of cedar and old paint. Outside, mist drifted across the hills, softening the world until it felt like a memory I hadn't lived yet. I made coffee with the old percolator on the stove and stood by the screen door barefoot, holding the mug in both hands. No noise, no expectations. No one knocking to check if I had signed something or packed enough sweaters for the retirement home. I took a long sip, and for the first time in years, the coffee tasted like freedom. At 9:15, my phone buzzed once. A message from Trina came through filed. Confirmed. Final. I didn't need more words. The documents had been processed. The trust transfer was done. The foundation was official. My name was now nowhere near that $15 million, and no one from my old life could touch it. At 9:30, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Mitchell. "Where are you then?" Another. "The car is here. They're waiting. And finally we need to talk." I placed the phone face down on the table and went outside. There was a trail behind the cabin that led into the trees. I walked until I reached a clearing with a bench made of driftwood and stones. I sat there for a long time, watching the branches sway. That afternoon I received another email, this one from Eleanor. She had opened the account under the foundation's new name. Everything had gone through smoothly. The local paper wanted to do a story on the organization. She asked if I wanted to be named in it. I told her no, not because I was ashamed, but because the silence was the point. What I had done didn't need applause. It needed to work. The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. I read, cooked my own meals, walked through the small town without looking over my shoulder. No one knew me there. No one expected anything. I liked it that way. Then, on Thursday, a headline caught my eye while I stood in line at a corner store. It was on the bottom of the local paper's front page: bank manager placed on leave amid family trust dispute. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. Mitchell worked in that field. It was only a matter of time before the ripple reached his desk. He had likely used internal systems, tried to forecast the payout, maybe even tapped into restricted data. Someone must have noticed or reported him. That night, the first email from Vanessa arrived. "What did you do?" I stared at the screen for a long time before closing it, without replying. The following morning, Eleanor called. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the edge. She told me someone had called the non-profit, pretending to be me, tried to change the registration, claimed I had made a mistake. When they asked for identification, the call dropped. We both knew who it had been. I asked her if she was okay. She said yes, but there was a pause. Then she added, "It's starting, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "It is." By that afternoon, 3 more messages had come in. One from a family friend saying Mitchell was under investigation. One from my old neighbor asking why Vanessa was ranting on social media. One from my niece simply writing, "You all right?" I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I sat down with the same red ledger I had carried across 3 states. I flipped through the pages slowly. Every entry, every decision, every dollar tracked with the care of someone who knew what people were capable of when they thought you were powerless. And now, that assumption was unraveling. On Saturday morning, the cabin phone rang. It startled me. Almost no one had that number. I picked up slowly. It was Trina. She said the press had begun to circle, that the foundation might make headlines whether we liked it or not. She asked if I wanted to prepare a statement. A quote. Anything. I told her not yet. Let them speculate. Let them imagine the woman they had dismissed was now sitting quietly in a place they couldn't find, building something they couldn't reach. That afternoon, I sat on the front step with a cup of tea. The wind shifted. Somewhere down the hill, a bell rang from a small chapel. I didn't believe in signs, but something about that sound, light and far off, settled in my chest. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting, waiting for the next ripple. Waiting, not because I was afraid, but because the time was coming when everything they had built on lies would crack. And when it did, I wouldn't raise my voice. I would simply continue. As planned. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable. Because I had already left. And the story they thought they controlled no longer belonged to them. The call came late in the afternoon, just as the clouds started curling low over the mountains. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the cabin, folding an old tea towel for the 5th time, not because it needed folding, but because my hands needed something to do. It was Trina again. Her voice carried more weight than usual. "He did it," she said. "He used your old house as collateral. 400,000. Signed it a week before the dinner." My breath caught, not in shock, not even in pain, just a deep, quiet ache that sat low in the chest. The house I had lived in for 30 years. The house that held the smell of my husband's flannel shirts and the dent in the floorboard where he used to tap his foot while reading the newspaper. He had taken it like it was his, signed it away while smiling across from me at a dinner table. He didn't even hesitate. I asked Trina what the bank had done. She said the loan had been flagged because of inconsistencies. The title hadn't fully cleared. My name was still connected through a minor clause that Trina had insisted stay in place until the full property reassignment was complete. That clause had bought us time. She said, "They're holding the funds, for now, but there's pressure from someone inside." I closed my eyes and sat back. This wasn't about money anymore. Not really, it was about the lengths people would go once they believed the world owed them something. It was about how entitlement could twist into something darker when you dressed it in enough justifications. I went to the window. The pines stood still. I stared past them, not looking at anything in particular. Mitchell had gambled, not in the way of casinos or cards, but with legacy, with blood, with the kind of trust that was built over quiet mornings and patched-up wounds. And he did it while I was sitting at the same table, pretending nothing was wrong. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid on the small bed under the faded quilt and watched the ceiling shift with the wind outside. I thought about how much silence I had tolerated over the years, not just from Mitchell, but from so many people. I had made room for everyone else's needs. I had bent, waited, reasoned. But no one came back to ask what I needed. In the morning, I took a walk down to the post office and mailed a single envelope to Trina. Inside was a handwritten note asking her to proceed with freezing any remaining claims tied to the Nebraska property. Along with that, I included a final declaration that relinquished all future family rights to the estate. I told her to file it publicly. No more questions. No more signatures hanging in the balance. Let them see what a locked door looks like. I came back and brewed tea. Lemon balm. My husband used to drink it at night. As I sat at the table, I pulled out an old notebook and turned to the back page. I wrote a list of every item in that house Mitchell tried to claim. Every corner of my life he had calculated into a $sign. Then I made another list of what he had never known. The small box of letters from my mother. The recipe my husband had written in the margins of a book. The quiet evenings alone after everyone had left, when I'd fold laundry and talk to the walls like they were listening. Things no deed could capture. Things no power of attorney could touch. A few days later, the cabin phone rang again. It was Eleanor this time. She said, "You might want to see the paper today." I walked to the town store and picked it up. The local section had a small article tucked in the bottom left. Financial misrepresentation. Alleged in private loan dealings. No names were printed, but I didn't need them. That evening, I received one last email from Mitchell. No subject line, no greeting, just 3 sentences. I made a mistake. I didn't think it would go this far. Can we talk? I closed the laptop. Not out of anger, but because I finally understood something. Some mistakes aren't accidents, they're decisions. And once you see that clearly, there's no way back. That night, I opened the window and let the cool air flood the room. I stood there in silence, feeling it move through the space like a truth finally spoken. What had been taken was no longer mine, but what I had built in its place was untouchable. The trust, the house, the story, mine, still mine. And no one would ever again sign my name without earning it. It started with a photo. Not of me, not directly, just a stock image of a woman around my age, grey hair pulled into a bun, looking out a rain-covered window. The headline under it read, "She gave them everything, then vanished." Eleanor forwarded me the link without a message. She didn't need one. I clicked and read every word. The article never mentioned my name, or Nebraska, or Mitchell, but it told the story all the same. A woman discovered her adult children had forged financial documents to seize control of her estate. A sudden $15 million donation redirected through a non-profit. An investigation underway by state financial agencies, still unnamed, still unofficial. I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel exposed. I felt recognized. The article didn't vilify anyone. It didn't dramatize. It just let the facts linger, like quiet footsteps in an empty hallway. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and made tea. 3 days later, Mitchell was placed on administrative leave, not fired, just put on hold. I heard through a family friend who still worked in the bank's legal department. She said the review board had flagged inconsistencies in recent internal authorizations. Someone whispered that a whistleblower tipped them off. I never asked if it was Trina. I didn't need to. Vanessa, on the other hand, wasn't quiet. Her social media exploded, posts every few hours. Some long, some panicked, some accusatory. She even uploaded a photo of my old porch with the caption, "This is what abandonment looks like when it wears pearls and silence." People commented. Some defended her, some didn't. Some asked why she thought she had a right to anything. I didn't read much of it. I had never been one to swim in public waters. But Eleanor skimmed the threads and gave me the gist. That night, Trina texted just 2 words. "Hold still, Jim stay." The next morning, I woke to find the article had been picked up by a larger outlet. National this time. They added details, not names, but close. A quote from someone labelled as a source close to the family said the woman in question had grown confused in recent years, that she had likely been manipulated by outside parties. That one stung a little. It was a predictable move, I knew that. Paint the woman as unstable, and the story unravels. I sat on the front porch of the cabin, wrapped in my husband's old cardigan, staring out at the treetops while the words replayed in my mind, manipulated, unstable, confused. I wasn't confused. I had been quiet. There's a difference. Eleanor offered to release a public statement through the foundation's legal team. Trina said she had documentation, recordings, timelines, all of it. She could shred their claims. One press release. But I told them no. Not yet. Let them say I'm confused. Let them scream into the void. The more they talk, the more people will listen to the silence on the other side and wonder why it sounds steadier. That same afternoon, Eleanor brought her laptop into the kitchen and played a short clip from a daytime news panel. A host read the article aloud, pausing after the main details to shake her head and say, "If that story's true, that woman is brilliant. I hope she writes a book." Eleanor laughed. I didn't, not because it wasn't funny, but because I wasn't doing this for cleverness or revenge. I just wanted the noise to stop. And for once, it had. Within 2 weeks, the Foundation's website saw more traffic than we could track. Volunteers offered to help. Messages poured in. Some were donations, some were stories. One woman from Arizona said she had tried to warn her mother about her brother's financial abuse, but was shut out. Another from Wisconsin said she had spent 2 decades caring for her husband, only to be excluded from the will by stepchildren she barely knew. One small envelope came by mail. Inside was a check for $25 and a handwritten note. For the women who waited too long to leave. We taped it to the wall above the desk. That scrap of paper meant more than any press coverage. Eventually, I received an email from Vanessa, a long one, a confusing mix of half-hearted apologies and veiled threats. She said Mitchell hadn't meant to hurt me, that things had gotten out of hand, that I owed them a chance to explain. I didn't respond. I deleted it. Because by then, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly before. This wasn't about misunderstanding. This wasn't about a mistake in judgment or miscommunication. This was a choice they made. Together. Eyes down wide open. They didn't take advantage of me because they thought I was weak. They took advantage because they thought I would stay quiet. And for a long time, I did. But now, that silence belonged to me. I controlled it. I chose where it went and where it didn't. The house back in Nebraska, the one Mitchell tried to mortgage behind my back, was caught in legal limbo. I imagined it standing there, empty, full of echoes and dust. A structure made of wood and concrete, but no longer holding anything that resembled home. The story was still making its way through the public. Podcasts picked it up. A few legal blogs debated the ethics of private wealth management. The irony was, the more anonymous I remained, the more powerful the narrative grew, because it could be anyone's story. Maybe that was the point all along. By the time the 3rd article came out, I had stopped saving clippings. I didn't need proof anymore. The justice wasn't in headlines. It was in the quiet way my breath no longer hitched when I thought about them. They were still reading, still searching the lines, still wondering what I might say next. But I wasn't writing for them anymore. I was writing for myself. For the women who folded their anger into drawers, who buried their dignity beneath dinner plates and photo albums. For those who learned too late that love without respect is just a leash. And for once, I was walking free. The kitchen was small, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without brushing arms. The light flickered in the early morning. There was a stubborn patch on the floor where the linoleum never laid flat. But it was mine now. I stood by the window most days with a mug of tea, watching the mist curl between the trees behind Eleanor's building. It was in that kitchen I decided to do something I hadn't done in decades. I started teaching again. Not formally, just a few women at a time, sitting around the chipped table, sharing coffee and numbers and stories. We called it the quiet ledger. I had spent so much of my life managing money for other people. Executives, logistics managers, tax strategists. They all trusted me when it came to balance sheets, but no one ever thought to ask if I had ever been taught to manage my own worth. Not just in numbers, in silence, in boundaries. Eleanor printed flyers for me on pastel cardstock. Trina helped review the legal disclaimers. We kept it simple, free classes for women over 50, no experience needed, no judgment. The first week, 3 women came. One had just lost her husband. One had been left out of her mother's will. The third didn't speak much, just nodded and took notes in a spiral-bound notebook that looked like it had been used for grocery lists. We didn't start with budgets. We started with a different kind of math. What did they give, over and over, that no one ever repaid? What did they hold in silence that cost them more than money? They cried quietly. Then they laughed. Then they stayed after the class ended and helped me wash dishes. Word spread. By the third week, we had 12 women, and the kitchen couldn't hold them all. Eleanor opened the church basement, fold-out chairs and a pot of weak coffee, but it was enough. I didn't tell them who I was. Not really. I never used names. I didn't mention Nebraska or Mitchell or Vanessa. I simply said that I used to think silence was a kind of peace, that I believed keeping the waters still was the best way to stay afloat. One of them, a woman named Nora, looked up with tired eyes and said she used to believe the same. Until her son sold the land her husband left her and told her it was for the family's good. She moved into a basement apartment after that. The quiet, she said, turned into a weight she couldn't name. We didn't need to name it. We just let it be what it was. I started keeping a small notebook of the stories, not their names, just the lessons. One page read, "She saved for 30 years, but never bought anything she liked." Another said she went to work sick for a decade so her husband could chase a dream that never called her name. I realized something in those meetings. The story I thought was just mine had been lived by thousands of women in pieces. Quiet thefts, silent agreements, contracts never written but always enforced. We didn't plan anything big. No protests, no petitions, just presence. We met every Tuesday. We passed around calculators and homemade cookies. We learned what it meant to draw a line that didn't need to be explained. One day, Eleanor brought a guest, a journalist, young, polite. She asked if she could sit in, said she wouldn't record anything, just wanted to listen. I looked at the women around the table. They nodded, so she stayed. After the session, she pulled me aside. She asked if I would give her a quote, something personal, something with teeth. I shook my head and said no, but I handed her one of the old ledger pages I had written years ago, when I was still married. It said, "To be invisible is not the same as being safe." She folded the page and said thank you. Later that week, a short column ran in the local paper, not front page, just a sidebar under community highlights. It described the Quiet Ledger as a financial literacy group for women navigating later life independence. No mention of me, no mention of the past. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. There was a new rhythm to my life now. I woke early, walked to the corner cafe for a plain bagel and black coffee. I read books again, not just articles, whole books. I wrote letters to people I had once known and to people I would never meet. Sometimes I sat by the window in silence, not because I was afraid of making noise, but because the quiet finally belonged to me. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to Mitchell, not to Vanessa, not to anyone who had tried to cut my story short before the ending was ready. Eleanor said once that healing often starts in kitchens, the kind where you stir old memories with new recipes, where women gather not to fix each other, but to remind each other that survival is not selfish, it is sacred. So we kept meeting, sometimes 5 women, sometimes 20, sometimes only 2, but always enough. Because in that little kitchen, and later in the church basement, we built something I had never seen in all my years in offices and boardrooms. We built dignity, quiet, unshakable. And every time I stood at the front of that room, Holding a worn calculator in one hand and a fresh pot of coffee in the other, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I had not been erased. I had started over. It came in a cream-coloured envelope, no return address, just my name written in blue ink across the front. I almost tossed it with the junk mail, but something about the handwriting made me pause. It looked careful, not decorative, just honest. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. The penmanship was small, slightly slanted, like someone had hesitated often but kept going anyway. The first line said, "I don't know if this will reach the right person, but I hope it does." She didn't sign her full name, just Beth. She wrote about her mother, about choices that couldn't be taken back. She said she had read something online, a quote from an anonymous woman about silence not being safety. She said it reminded her of the way she used to speak to her mother, the way she dismissed her concerns, called her paranoid, accused her of exaggerating. She wrote, "I didn't realize until it was too late that I was repeating the same things my father used to say to both of us." Beth said her mother had passed last year. She said the guilt settled in places therapy couldn't quite reach. But reading that line, the one from my ledger, felt like someone had gently shaken her awake, like she'd been underwater, and now the surface was finally visible. She didn't ask for anything, not forgiveness, not a reply. She just wanted to say she saw it now. She understood. She said if I had another chance, I would have listened. Not defended. Just listened. I held the letter for a long time. My thumb pressed into the edge of the paper, soft, from folding. I didn't cry, but my chest felt hollow in a way I hadn't felt since the day I left Nebraska. Not heavy, just open. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my own notebook, the one with all the quiet stories. I turned to a blank page. I wrote. She wrote back, even though her mother couldn't read it. I thought about all the women I had met in the past few months, the ones who still walked with the weight of words unsaid, the ones who had stopped expecting apologies. I wondered how many daughters carried silence too, how many sons would wake up too late, how many stories ended before the repair could even begin. I didn't write a long reply. I didn't try to console or advise. I simply wrote, "You listened now. That counts." Then I folded it, sealed it, and mailed it to the only return address I had, the P.O. box she'd scribbled at the bottom corner of the page. Eleanor found me in the kitchen afterward, still holding the letter's envelope. She didn't ask anything. She just poured us both a cup of tea and sat beside me. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was shared. I kept Beth's letter, slipped it into the back of my notebook. I didn't frame it or read it aloud in the next session. It wasn't for that. It was a quiet gift. A bridge built too late for one woman, but just in time for someone else. And that, I realized, was the quiet power of stories. Not their volume, not their reach, but their ripple. How one life, spoken plainly, could find its way into another heart without ever asking to. That night, I dreamed of the house in Nebraska, not as it had been, not filled with tension and paperwork, just the version I never got to live in. The kitchen warm, the air soft, Mitchell and I sharing toast, no words between us, only understanding. When I woke, I didn't feel grief. I felt still. Because even if that version never came true, I had lived long enough to give it to someone else. And maybe that was the whole point of survival. To make something gentler from the wreckage. To send a letter into the dark and trust that someone, somewhere, would light a match. It was a grey Tuesday morning. The rain had been steady since dawn, the kind that never poured but never stopped either. I had come early to the church basement, flipped on the lights, set up the chairs, wiped down the long folding table out of habit more than necessity. The air smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and old wood. I was placing handouts on each seat when the door creaked. I didn't look up right away. There were always a few early birds who came to help set up. But something about the silence behind me made me stop. I turned. He was standing at the threshold, soaked from the rain, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Mitchell. My son. He looked older than I remembered. Not tired, just weathered. The boyish arrogance had faded, and in its place stood a man who had clearly lost control of a story he thought he was writing. I met his eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't step in. He just stood there, taking in the folding chairs, the whiteboard, the smell of weak church coffee drifting from the kitchenette. For a second, the years collapsed. I saw the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, the teenager who stopped hugging me after 8th grade, the man who called once a month and thought that counted as love. I didn't move toward him. He didn't speak. We stood there, mother and son, with a whole ocean of silence between us. But it wasn't the kind that drowned anymore. I gave him a small nod, nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. Then I turned back to the table, adjusted a stack of handouts, smoothed the corner of the cloth. When I looked again, he was gone. No door slam, no retreating footsteps, just gone. The women started arriving one by one. Nora brought pumpkin bread. Sandra had a new notebook. We settled into our rhythm, the scrape of chairs and clink of mugs. I began the session like always, calm, steady, present. Later, when I walked home through the misty air, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel vindicated either. What I felt was stillness. Not everything needs closure. Not every wound needs to be reopened and cleaned. Sometimes the absence of harm is enough. Sometimes silence is no longer a weapon. It's just space, clean air, a path forward. I reached my little kitchen, boiled water, and sat by the window. I opened my notebook and wrote down one last line for the week he came. And I kept teaching. I looked out as the clouds began to lift. The sky over Portland was never perfectly blue, but today it was open just enough to feel like a beginning. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I chose. And that, in the end, was everything. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or carried a silence that wasn't yours to bear, this story is for you. You don't have to shout to reclaim your voice. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk forward and not look back. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear where you are now in your own journey. Feel free to share, reflect, or just sit quietly with me here in this small corner where dignity still has a name.